Thank you, Jesse. Welcome, everybody. This is a meeting of the Community Board for Manhattan Community Board for 12 FAR Working Group. Our goal is to try to see if we can't figure out what to do about the potential from the state potentially lifting the 12 FAR cap at the state level and how we manage this at the city level. I'm chairing this committee, and committee members present today are Roberta Barnett, Dave Solnick, and Carrie Keenan, and Lowell Kern. With that being said, I'd like to just kind of dive in. Again, respectful of everyone's time, we go until 5 o'clock, and I know other people have other commitments. So I wanted to get this group together again to try to figure out kind of where we stand in the process. If people feel like we have now had enough research and presentations that we can start working on formulating a position to present to the executive committee. If people feel there are still unanswered questions that they want to spend more time trying to get people in to do presentations and learn more and see where we stand. I sent an earlier email today to committee members kind of outlining what I've taken so far as sort of broad strokes from the presentations and the discussions we've had, that we're concerned that the city has no plan. If the cap were ever to be lifted, the city would not know how to address it. We don't understand where the higher density housing could exist, whether it's currently to circumvent 12 FAR caps or places where it would actually make sense for it to occur or likely to occur such that we would want to prepare for it. We seem to have a consensus that we need to have language to protect affordability and making sure that any higher density has a very high component of affordability to it, and that we protect our historic districts and special districts. And that maybe we start talking about potential areas where higher density housing might make sense, such as commercial conversions of existing overbuilt buildings, or in areas that are currently zoned for high density as it is. So that's kind of where I thought we stood, and just wanted to open up to committee members to get some thoughts. Welcome, Viren.
Hey, Paul.
Lowell raised his hand, so let me call on him.
I tried to do this the right way.
Yeah, thanks, Lowell. Appreciate it. And David, I heard you starting to talk, so I'll come to you second.
I appreciate your summary, Paul, and I think that pretty much captures the, I'm talking about the written summary you sent out earlier. That pretty much captures where we are, although if you'll remember, David and I got into a discussion the very first time we met about whether we wanted to say anything to the state. It wasn't addressed in your summary, Paul. And I do think we should be putting the state on notice of, if you lift the cap, we would like you to put some restrictions in there so it's not left just to the city. I know David disagrees with me, or at least did disagree with me in the past, but that's my feeling on it. I don't want to go into the specifics yet, but I did want to point that part out.
Well, Lowell, it was sort of intentional though, because one of the notes from a previous meeting that I had circulated, we had as a group kind of come to a consensus not to address the state. So I
must have missed that meeting then.
I think that the language, I think what we need to do is, in the language of any policy guidelines or proposals we make, should say, this is if the state were to ever take action, because right now the state's not doing anything, right? So to say to the state, if you do something, you've got to do this or this or that, that opens up the can of worms of home rule and all those other concerns that people have about telling the state, telling them to tell us what to do or not to do. So
I understand that. I don't recall that discussion, so it's possible I missed that meeting. I do remember discussing in the meeting. I disagree with that, but I'll go along with the consensus.
And Lowell, what I think we need to do is make sure that the language we put into whatever we end up with, whether it's a policy guideline or a proposal or outlines or whatever, that we just be careful about the language that says we don't support lifting the cap. We're not promoting lifting the cap. This is a city issue, and the city should be prepared for situation in which the cap is lifted, and that we need to even think about ways that perhaps higher density could exist in our city, sort of around the cap.
No, I understand that, but
So we'll just look at that language.
Yeah, my position would be that we tell the state, we think you should lift the cap and give the city home rule, but not unfettered home rule. And the one thing that I would specifically would have said to the state, and I'll drop this after this since I realize I'm outnumbered here, is the affordable housing component.
Yeah. I think the consensus too amongst everybody is affordability has to be a component of any higher density. It's just
Right.
There's no way that it's not, right?
And well, of course, there's a way that it's not. The state lifts the cap and the city doesn't include it.
Right. Well, that's their position, but our position is pretty clear.
Yeah. And that's why I would tell the state, because I trust the city government probably less than I trust the state government at this point.
Yeah.
But that may also be a reflection of the fact that I once ran for state office. So.
Yeah. Personal politics aside. All right, David, I promise I'd call on you next. Then I see Roberta and then Carrie.
I mean, most of what I have to say is more conclusionary, if that's a word. But on this topic, I mean, it's sort of interesting that, Sammy's Law just got, shelved, which is a home rule, but something bringing the speed limits on our streets back to the city. And I think it sends a very bad message for us to be cherry picking the things that we want Big Daddy to do for us because we don't trust or we don't think we're competent enough to handle them. Cherry picking those, this issue and not that issue. And if I was if I was a state legislator, an assemblyman, I'd be going, well, look, I mean, either you guys are for home rule or you're not. You don't get to, to sort of play both sides of this game. And so I think we're sending a very bad message to the state that we are, that if we were, I mean, fortunately, the consensus is that we don't have that position. And I think it would be a very dangerous position to have to send to the state that we're for home rule when we like it and we're against home rule when we don't. I mean, either we believe in ourselves or we don't.
All right, but let's, as we know, let's not debate that. Continue debating that issue. We've had that debate already. So
I have a number of other things to say, but they're more, like I said, they're more about our questions and such. So I can hold off on that.
No, I called on you to ask, where do you think we should go and what?
Okay.
That's the question before us all is, where do we go from here?
Okay. What I think the scheme should be is that there is a trigger, which I've mentioned before, and the trigger is that if the state FAR cap is lifted, there is immediately one imposed by the city. The same regulation with one exception. So the fear of, oh my God, the state's not controlling this now, we're in trouble. No, it just triggers the same regulation at the city level. Exception, however, that the problem is that state projects can't be regulated by a city zoning law. And so state projects would be suddenly freed of the cap because the city can't control them. And so what I'm saying is the trigger should be the state cap should remain in effect, but be lifted and transferred to the city for everything else. So that's one trigger. That's trigger number one. Trigger number two, and let me explain this trigger number two. This is a very complicated project. There is no way this committee is going to come up with how to replace the zoning that the FAR cap would remove. The zoning is very complicated. It's site specific. It involves sustainability issues. It involves affordability issues. it's a whole, zoning regulations. They're very complicated. And so my second trigger would be the creation of an ad hoc committee that is charged with new zoning to replace what's lifted at the state level. Like I said, which is that there's really no change until that ad hoc committee completes its work. And that ad hoc committee should include representatives from the community boards that have high density high density areas. I don't see any reason why it should include all the community boards of the city. That would be extremely cumbersome, but certainly the ones that would be impacted by this change in the FAR cap. But it also, of course, would include presumably representatives from city planning, borough president, another, obviously a host of others. So, it might be a committee of, 10, 12, 15 people. And that committee would be charged with wrestling this complexity to the ground and coming up with and it might include zoning. They might be zoning consultants within that group and so on and so forth. So that would be my two-part trigger to the lifting of the state cap.
All right, I have some thoughts on that, but I want to call in some others. Roberta?
So just two things following on David's point. I do want to just make two things clear. When lifting the cap does nothing to existing zoning, there already is a cap everywhere. It is the existing zoning parameters. So whatever the zoning says, you cannot, unless there's like some very particular relief, which there is for commercial conversions, unless there's some very particular, zoning resolution or relief for a particular change in use or a change in bulk, everything must go through the land use review process. And I think that's actually really valuable because it means that if you did want to either look at either commercial conversions of newer buildings or the development of buildings in excess of 12 FAR, there would be a public review process. I'm not saying it is a perfect process. I don't think anyone is, thrilled with the alert process, but I do think that that is helpful. The other thing I would second, I think that this would likely, and I imagine legislators would also support this, is that the city, can override its own cap, but to leave that in place for the UDC and for the state effectively, so that the state would not be able to go in excess of 12. That might be, that would make sense only because the state isn't ultimately subject to a public review process like any changes at the city level would be. And so I think that helps avoid some potential concerns about, the abuse of power that might be wielded with the additional openness to the lifting of the cap. If I personally were to articulate a position, I would not specifically advocate for any neighborhood or several block rezonings. I would say that if there are projects that developers would like to bring forward in communities and in particular areas that the board and other boards deem somewhat appropriate for greater residential bulk, and that might be places where you have high density commercial. It may also be places that are formerly manufacturing or industrial, where a new, bulkier or taller structure does not ultimately impede access to light and air, that those might be appropriate sites, but that it wouldn't necessarily make sense to, as of right, allow them to go to, 13, 14, 15 FAR, and that those should be subject to a public review process. And within that public review process, they should be subject to mandatory inclusionary housing. And I would just tie that to whatever the city is doing right now. They've amended it a little bit in the past couple of years with the intention of making it more affordable, but just tying it to the city's process for new construction, I think makes it a lot more seamless than it would be otherwise. certainly better than trying to come up with a new regime for affordability. And I do think it's certainly important to note that the protections that should be required around the historic and special districts in CB4. The Clinton Special District in particular presents kind of a challenge because in the part of it that is, I guess, east of like 11th Avenue, that part is, could be very well, the individual tenement buildings could be threatened by taller buildings. It might impede their access to light and air. It could be a genuine health and safety concern. But then I know that in our affordable housing report, we have also looked at adding bulkier structures on the other side of 11th Avenue. So that might be contextual depending on, what happens at some point later in the future. Just one place to note. Beyond that, I think it's certainly, a priority for the community to protect the historic and special districts, and certainly something that we would want to ask the city to do if we were to promote anything here. I think that's everything I have initially.
Right. Thanks, Willie. Carrie?
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. That was very cool and enlightening. I'm just I need to sort of level set myself. Because the board's position right now is that we are against the lifting of the cap.
That's not true.
It's not true?
No, we have not. We have no position.
So we
Well,
never
that's what-
sent the letter?
We didn't. No, we did not. That's the purpose of this working group, is because there is no position of the board, and that's why this working group was created.
Okay, because I want to make sure, like, are we suggesting that our position is pro lifting the cap with these, considerations, or these?
No, I think that the position is, if the state were to ever lift the cap, the city needs to have a plan in place to address that. Like,
Because-
it's not saying one way or the
yeah.
other. It's saying there is no plan. There is a cap in place right now. It's not threatened at this point because the legislative process has stopped.
Yep.
The city does not have a plan in the city right now as to how to deal with that.
I guess one of my concerns is that we've been hearing from, everybody who's shown up from the community so far has, maybe with the exception of one person, has pretty adamantly been against even taking the position that we would consider lifting the cap. So at what point are we, talking about the community that's coming to these meetings?
Well, that's exactly what this has been, because there, and that goes back to the debate between Lowell and David about whether or not to take a position on lifting the cap. We're not taking a position on that. We're saying that if the cap is lifted, we need to make sure that we protect our special districts and historic districts. We need to make sure that there's an affordability component in any high density residential, that we, all these things that the community has expressed concerns about if the cap were to be lifted. But every member of the community who's come to talk about the fear of lifting the cap has been complaining that it doesn't, lifting the cap doesn't guarantee affordability in housing stock. So, all right, let's address the affordability component and let's figure out a way that we can have the city plan to incorporate more affordability if there is higher density, right? So the questions we're asking are sort of a result of the community's outcry, but there is no position on the cap itself.
So then to Lowell's question, we can put together a wish list. If we seem like I understand you're saying there's no position, but I do think it's sort of an if then, which is a sort of a subtle way of saying yes. How do we guarantee that all of the, these points are not just considered or blown off, but actually implemented? Like, what is as a community board, we are not lawmakers. Like, what should we do before we say these things to make sure that they actually happen? Which I think has been the concern the whole time, right? That we can say we want affordability and then hear from people who say that that's not really feasible for builders.
Well, but we
So right now, the
different avenues to take with that, and that's exactly what we're trying to get at. And you know, David raised a point, and I kind of wanted to go back to this anyway, so maybe I'll tackle this as part of the answer to your question, Carrie. Is that David saying we should create an ad hoc committee to look at new zoning? And as Roberta points out, we already have caps in place on residential. The zoning code kind of restricts things. So by lifting the cap, that means, right? And one of the things is that would have to go through a ULURP, they'd have to rezone. The example I use is, you know, some large corporation could come in and buy all of Penn South right now and give all of those shareholders more equity than they can imagine in their lifetimes, raise that entire compound and put in 33 FAR commercial towers, right? Like that's the notion of rezoning to put in something else. I described that Penn South as a zoning to put in high density residential is not necessarily the best storyline to follow. I can see examples of how that might happen. So the rezoning itself, I think, is something, and we talked City Club's proposal of a R11 residential zone, you know, creating a new high density zone would make sense. And we as a group decided not to tackle that because, Carrie, as you point out, you know, we're a small advisory council, right, with no legislative powers to say. But we can talk about how to protect the interests of our district. So we can say if the cap is lifted, we want to make sure that it's highly restricted. And you know, there's been suggestions that each application is separate and unique. Maybe what we recommend is a special permit for any high density housing. So anybody coming in looking for higher density housing above 12 has to go through a special permit process, which involves the community. And maybe that special permit is only allowable in certain zones. We're not rewriting entire zoning. We're making a recommendation that the city prepare for higher density and they're taken to protect our community. Is that?
I mean, anything, I think, you know, any protection that we can put in. I mean, I'm not maybe as distrustful as Lowell is saying he is, but I don't know in the end, you know, how much power I mean, I know we have power, but like, you know, how much power do we really have? So also I wanted to ask, my last question is, maybe somebody on this panel knows, but you know, there's this argument between the governor and the Senate, and it's like, it seems like none of the things that the assembly members and Senate and state senators wanted to move forward with in terms of helping, you know, with the housing crisis are moving forward without the lifting of the cap, that it's this fight. And I just wanted to know if anyone knows why, like with some of the other things that they put forward, like there's a statement that they put out. And one of them is commercial conversion.
I mean, I can answer that. I will say, to my understanding, that there is no requirement for lifting and proceed with a negotiation. There are other like pain points, but the this particular one is, my understanding, is not a make or break element here.
It just feels like we've often got or heard this position that it's like, we can't do anything until we lift the cap. So it felt a little bit like that again, you know, from the governor's side, like we can't do anything until we lift the cap, which seems strange.
I hadn't heard that. So Carrie, if you want to circulate
I'll send
that
it to
around,
you. Yeah,
that'd be helpful.
it's just
Yeah,
a very
thanks.
simple one pager statement.
Yeah,
but yeah,
that'd be
yeah.
great. I'd love to see it.
Sure.
Christine, I'm going to go to Lowell and wait for hands up, and then I'll come to non-committee members. So Lowell, your hand was up.
Okay, in response to what Carrie just said, Carrie, you know, I don't look at the fight of telling the state what to do is over, because this committee's report still has to go to the full board. And I can always raise, and I will probably raise my concern there and let the other 40 some odd members of the board think about it. But that being said, if this is the approach we are taking, here's what I would love to see. I love Roberta's idea of a special permitting process. I would forbid any anything above current zoning in a historic district or a special district. I would allow any conversion in any existing commercial building that exceeds 12. The building's there already. I don't care what happens on the inside of the building. Make it commercial, make it residential. And of course, there has to be a percentage of affordability, and I would not go below the 30% we usually demand for a new building. In fact, I'd consider going higher since it's a bigger building, but I tried to pin down Mr. Lalazarian on that, and I couldn't, get him to give up any kind of numbers. But those are the four things that I would like to see us advocate for.
I'm sorry, say them again. Protect special districts, allow and higher density.
All right, so
allow
the
and-
first one is the special permitting process.
A special permit. You like that?
Kudos to Ms. Barnett. Number two is no.
Roberta, was that your idea?
No, this
One of-
was Paul's idea, perhaps inspired, but
She's the one who brought it to us today, so I'm giving her credit, Paul, and I'm not gonna sit there and pat you on the back for all of the work you've done. In any
Actually,
case,
I first heard about it from Christine Berthet. So anyway, so special
I'll
permit.
credit Christine and Roberta. Paul, you don't count.
I don't get anything. I get this.
No change should be allowed in any, no change in zoning should be allowed in any special district or historic district.
Okay.
Number two, what was number two?
So a special permit, no change, allow in higher
number
density and
three
allow in commercial conversion.
Is I would allow any change in an existing, whatever they want to do in an existing commercial building is fine because the building's already there.
Yeah.
And number four is the requirement of affordability.
All right. I want to just open up that conversation for a second on the requirement of affordability, because David, you and I had an offline conversation about this in terms of setting a minimum. And I tend to agree that setting a minimum of 30% affordability across the board is a nice line to draw in the sand. We did hear from the development community that anything over 10 is economically infeasible, and that doesn't make any sense to me. And I don't think that that's a position we should take. And there was an argument made that we should say there should be affordability, and each application can come in and define what they think is economically feasible. And my feeling on that is, if we draw the line at 30, if an individual comes in and says it's not economically feasible to do 30, we want to do 25, and they negotiate down as opposed to us trying to negotiate up, it would make a little bit more sense. So I'm also in favor of having a bare minimum of affordability component in anything that's higher density. And I also look at, by the way, commercial conversions that are overbuilt already have the density bonus in place. So those would also force a requirement for the minimum affordability component.
But just, Paul, to add to sort of flesh that out a little bit, that when you said they could negotiate down from 30, I would say it isn't simply it's not just a matter of negotiating skill. It's a matter of that would trigger for them the requirement to produce a third-party audit financial audit that supports that lowered affordability.
Yeah.
We talked about that.
Yeah, you're right, we did. But it could be language of a special permit, right?
Yeah.
All right, so Roberta, I'm going to go to you, and then Christine, I know you've been very patient. And so, but generally, Lowell, I think you're reflecting the kind of the four major points that seem to be a consensus now anyway. So Roberta?
That was my intent, Paul.
I think the form of affordability makes a great deal of sense. I do think it continues to make sense to align it with some sort of requirement, MIH being one that I think makes a lot of sense. MIH at the lowest end would be 20, and that would be for 40% area median income. So at the very low option, you do go down to 20. And then 30% is at 80% of area median income for MIH right now. So it's not wild to say 30, but there might be a desire to get some deeper affordability in there. So offering a little bit of flexibility there and aligning it with existing requirements, I do believe may make some sense. I would also say that we have a completely different scenario for commercial conversions. The commercial conversions that are done with substantial government assistance can now take advantage of J51. And the legislature reauthorized J51, and I believe that the governor will sign it. So that would be a possibility as to how to buy affordability, so to standards of affordability for buildings that have substantial government assistance. If they're getting a direct subsidy from HCR or HPD to either do the and there's no way to buy the affordability. I'm not saying there should be no requirement, but with the affordability. But the good news is there's at least some. There's no longer one for new construction in terms of a as of right tax incentive, but it doesn't stop the agencies, both state and city, from putting forth financing for some of these projects that would enable that affordability. It's just slightly less accessible. So I guess the summary there would be just, aligning the affordability requirements with the way that these projects are financed, I think makes a lot more sense than just saying, we just want 30% affordability, to me personally. Because I think we can ask for more in certain circumstances, and in other places, it would be a lot harder, is my impression.
And Roberta, can I ask, do you know if the CB4 housing plan has any language like that we could just extract and copy and say, look, this is the position the board has on its housing plan, so let's just incorporate very similar language here?
It doesn't, but there are sort of different proposed income mixes for different projects. There are kind of a couple of, the contextual certain projects. For example, like the supportive housing at the old women's prison that could make use of historic tax credits, which are not available to, a random garment district office building. And so they're able to kind of look at different affordability with different types. But and then I guess the other point, I think Anna Levin made this point as well. There is increasingly at the city level in particular, a move away from the board's position of interest in moderate and middle income affordability in inclusionary housing, and toward the lower end, the deeper affordability end. And that will, I don't know preferences of the community, but it is worth flagging in this larger context because it may be harder to export pieces from the affordable housing plan into something that ultimately gets done if the city winds up pushing more and more toward the deeper affordability end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Christine, I know you've been patient. Go to Christine and then Lowell, I'll come back to you.
Addressing what Carrie was talking about, I think the concept we are using in BLP, which is to deny unless, would be probably the framing of whatever, a good framing for whatever this group says, right? It's not like we agree, and if you do it, it would be, we don't want it unless you absolutely do that, right? And we don't have all the power, but at least we can communicate your point, which is, we're just not in favor unless you put something very strong in place, right? So that's the first thought. I think the idea of, we are very uncomfortable with the city community board, city planning and council control. It would be a one-by-one decision, and it could be much more well designed to what Roberta is talking about. There is a certain financing, there's a lot of moving pieces there, and it could be all differently done. So I think that special permit is a very important concept. Then we say we don't want to do it in those places. I would say the other way. I would say, where do we want to do it, right? And where do we want to do it? It's the same place. We want to do it in the existing commercial zoning, which already have an FAR above 12. And that is where it should apply. That's it, nowhere else. And then for the conversion, obviously the conversion of existing commercial building on a one-off. And so if you were going to say that, the only area which would be targeted really for us would be the northern part of Hudson Yard. Nothing else would be eligible for that special permit. So we reduce the footprint of what is eligible. And then this discussion about the affordable space, I think 30%, I think we should say we have a target of 30%. And then use all the technique that David and Roberta were talking about making it, changing it a little bit or aligning with the financial, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we need to have a discussion about the AMIs, which I think it should be the maximum income is 80% of AMI, and then a fair amount of space reserved for homeless. And for some people have raised the issue of affordable ownership, which is not addressed very much these days, which could be something that is valuable. And then indeed adding community facilities like, at the community board discretion, up to 4 floors, school, FAR, NYPD, etc., pre-K, and then that would adjust the percent of affordability, percent of affordable space that is produced, because that would be a mix. But all those things would come in the special permit. So this would be like, project by project, you look at it and you say, okay, what do we do with that? So that would be, I think it's consistent with what everybody has said, but it's a little bit of what, how, what, and where, to present it in a way which is very clear that we are not in support, generally speaking. We are in support for a very specific area and in a very specific way. And if it's not that, then we're not in support for the city at large and for everything else. So that's it.
Christine, let me ask you a follow-up on that. And it kind of ties into what Roberta was talking about earlier in terms of, and also Lowell, the notion of like these GPPs where the state comes in and says, all right, the state has removed the cap, the city has a cap in place, but the GPP can do whatever they want. So
but we need to make a clear exception in that. I mean, in the deny unless, that should be one of the first thing, which says, the state has to comply with the policy of the city, and the policy would be you bring a special permit, and you bring it only in those areas, right? You don't bring it for another area that we have not thought about.
Well, because I'm thinking specifically of Penn Station area.
Yeah,
like,
yeah, I know.
Could we get more housing in Penn Station area in those high density zoned places? That's kind of where I'm going on that thought train. Okay.
Well,
thanks.
I guess if we describe the footprint acceptable as a commercially zoned high density, then you would get your the Penn Station area folded into the north Hudson Yard.
Lowell, I'm going to skip over to Varen because he hasn't spoken yet, and I'll come back to you. Varen?
Yeah, just very quickly. Permitting is a very good conversation, but as you know, permitting is very much part of ULURP process. So it's already woven into the city's ways of doing things. When there are exceptions to be made or changes to be made, whether it's bulk, bulk or use or whatever the types of changes that folks might want to make, it has to go through ULURP. So we already have a kind of mechanism in place from city planning. So by we can restate it, but I think it's already covered. Number two, unless you have a question, Paul, can I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. The second thing is that when we talk about affordability, I think we really need to take a position about AMI and affordability. And I'm not just assuming it only for our district, but even across the city, AMI has been kind of pushing affordability component away from supply component, but we should define the percentages of low, moderate, higher, whatever that we have. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the density and lifting of 12 FAR cap pertain because commercial doesn't have 12 cap. So it's all about residential. And the affordability as into AMI. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm wary of that. There's so many flaws in that system that to have this working group try to tackle which AMI bands are acceptable or not acceptable,
I'm not
and then how that's defined, I think that becomes quite.
Yeah, I'm not
Pandora's
suggesting I'm not suggesting we give them definition. What we're saying is that they should consider the AMI component because affordability is hugely tied with it. So depending on which district, which community, which borough, like this is going to be applied to, I think the AMI conversation should always remain part of affordability component because otherwise, let's talk about 80% AMI. That's a pretty high number. In terms of,
but again, I would kind of, I would want to integrate this into our housing plan. If we have within the housing plan some language on affordability and how we define that, what our goals are in terms of AMI and what from the housing committee, the work that's already been done on affordability concerns, so that our position on affordability is consistent with what the board has already taken in the past.
Well, the lifting of 12 FAR cap is with an excuse that we want to increase affordability component across the city. We want to increase affordable housing across New York City, which is why we want to lift the 12 FAR cap. It's not just purely simple, any kind of housing. So you can't not tie that into it. I think that's my suggestion. And I can give you some language.
I think I'm confused with what you're saying, Baron, because I'm in agreement. I think everyone's in agreement that we have to have any increase in density requires a percentage of affordability. And now the question is, how do we define the affordability?
Paul, just so you know, there is a portion in the housing plan, if you would like me to read it for the group, I can. It says the board supports revised zoning text to require that new development should be 30% affordable, not 20% affordable, and should accommodate individuals at families at a range of incomes between 40% and 165% of area median income. I don't know if we can just explore that.
Why not weave that into this as well? Why not weave it? If
No, I think, Viren, I think we're all in agreement. We take that language and put it in this.
Absolutely, that's all I'm suggesting, nothing else.
Okay, yep, we're in agreement then.
Yeah, and in terms of permitting, I think if you really want to flag that, you can go ahead and flag it, but there's a very robust mechanism already in place. And it may be tweaked depending on what the projects might be, but ULURP is the mechanism for changing the permitting sort of policies. And it's not like one shoe fits all. Depending on the site, project, scale, density, whatever have you, the permitting process.
Advantage of the special permit, right, is that each is unique.
Saying instead of the special permit, you don't have to have a special permit to have a customized process, right, Viren?
Hard time hearing you, Christine. Can you say it again?
I think what you are saying is that with the ULURP process provides the customization that we are thinking about. And
Yes.
you don't have to have a special permit in order to achieve that.
No, you don't have to. The special permit is basically giving weapons in the hands of wrong people. Let the ULURP process play out and let the permitting be defined as part of that process. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Lowell?
Okay, first point, and Roberta just read something where it says that we want 30% affordable, not 20. That was written back in 2014 originally, when the city was doing 20 and this board was pushing 30. So this board has always been on the cutting edge of pushing for more affordability. So I would ignore whatever the city guidelines are now and ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's the first point. Second point, Christine's point about a GPP being able to come in and blow this whole thing out of the water. That goes back to why we need to tell the state what to do, because the city can't tell the state what to do and say that the GPP, your GPP is subject to city rules. Third point on the AMIs. No, let me do a different one. Third point on Viren's point, I have made clear my complete disdain for the ULURP and the current process that's in place after I saw what happened at the MTA site. So I would rather keep to a special permit process, even though Viren represents that there is a customization process. I have absolutely zero faith in ULURP at all to get anything done. Fourth point on the AMIs, I'm fine with the language that's in the housing plan. I know the city is pushing toward the low end, but when I joined this board a decade ago, one of the first things I learned about was the donut hole. You know, that everyone will build really low and everyone will build really high because they make money on really high and they get subsidies on really low, and no one builds that middle. And I now have a 27-year-old son, and I'm watching all of him and his friends bounce around. They need to find a new roommate. They need to move out of Manhattan. They need to move home with their parents because they're all making decent salaries, or what would be a decent salary in Iowa, but they can't afford to live in Manhattan where they all grew up. So I'm okay with the 40 to 165 ban. I would not skew it one way or the other, though, because, you know, I'm representing a specific contingent here. I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks, Lowell. And I think that I want to echo your point that in 2014, the city was pushing for 20 and now we're pushing for 30. And now the standard tends to be 30. And you said let's shoot for the stars and the moon. You know, do we just leave it at 30 because that's in the housing plan and go forward? Or do we want to change?
I would push it. I would push it higher. Ask for more. We're not going to get it. We know we're not.
So
going
one of the earliest
this board is one of the reasons the city's now at 30.
Right. Let me answer that question.
So let's ask for 40.
So one of the other suggestions at one of our meetings was that anything above 12 goes to 40. So not the entirety of the project is at 40, but if you can go to 12, and then if you go to 14, the 2 FAR has to be at 40.
I'm fine with that.
Or the 16, that additional 4 has to be at 40.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with something like that. But my point is that
this
board and the Housing, Health, and Human Services Committee was, you know, part of the reason the city has moved from 20.
No, I understand, but I'm trying to find a way to
I'm okay with your suggestion. I'm okay with this.
Do other people, either show of hands or whatnot, agree that maybe we push the envelope on the affordability and say it's a marginal increase over 12 is 40?
I think the risk you have.
All right, Carrie?
I was showing my support for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Viren?
Yeah, very quickly. I just have a, when you say anything that is higher than 12.
I'm sorry, Viren, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I have a problem with this computer. I have to fix it. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. What I'm saying is that if you say that anything that is above 12 FAR is where we actually put the affordability component, you basically are killing the whole process, mainly because taller buildings cost money.
No. Okay. I'm saying up to 12 is 30, above 12 is 40.
Oh, I understand. Yeah, I'm with it.
So it's a marginal increase above 12.
Understood better now. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you raising that point because I may not have been clear. Roberta?
Certainly open to it as a target. I would also say, you know, if there's a substantial amount of city or state or federal grant money going to a project, to, you know, say we should push even higher where there is really substantial government assistance on these projects, with the understanding that, you know, every project is a bit different.
And perhaps, Roberta, you might be able to answer this question, then in a special permit process, if somebody comes in and we know they're getting a lot of additional city funding, we can push the number up.
In general, yeah, we could ask the developer, you know, what is possible, and they will try and figure out, you know, what sources of financing they're able to cobble together to create. Yeah, you know, sort of like
David's point earlier about having nothing and having each applicant come in with a proposal. We're saying this is where we want you to be. We can work on adjusting those numbers.
Yeah.
Paul, it's
and
a
the
target.
language.
Paul, it's a target. It's not a hard number. It's a target.
Yeah.
And I think we should aim the target higher.
Yep.
Yeah, what
Aaron?
I was saying, what I was saying, Paul, is that it has to be lifting of 12 FAR cap has to be linked with affordability component. So it's not giving them
Correct.
a choice that you come with the plan, but this is linked. You want it, that's how it's going to have to be. Does that make
Right.
sense?
And that ties in with David's trigger language. If
Exactly.
this happens, then, and it goes back to Carrie, you've used the term if then clause, right? Like that makes you sort of, if this were to happen, then this is required.
Correct.
This can't happen unless you meet these requirements.
Deny unless I prefer to if then.
All right. Can I get from the committee members a position, deny or less yes or deny or less no? So just say yes if you agree with us taking a deny unless position. So Roberta,
Wait, what are we're denying what?
Exactly.
denying the lifting of the cap.
Denying the lifting of the cap.
Unless this list of conditions. is
Unless
met.
these conditions are met.
No, I would suggest
And
that
who is that so that's directed at the city. So this is like an individual Euler. This is like the state has in this particular scenario.
So that raises a good question, Roberta. I mean, I'm thinking that we're writing
That
something
was
to
my
go to
question.
the city. We're writing something to go to the city. Right? So the city, we're saying to the city, right now, you all have, the city has a 12 cap in place, right? The state removes it, now the city can take action. So what we're saying to the city is, if the state does this, we don't want this to happen unless these conditions are met.
So the city should not
Make
allow
any,
unless. So
correct.
unless the city should not allow residential buildings in excess of 12 FAR unless the various conditions that we have discussed today are met. That would be the sort of language there?
Is
Yeah.
that-
Paul, what I'm saying is that you say deny unless when there's a proposal that you're denying or approving. Here you're putting a set of conditions. If you want to sort of frame it a bit more positively, saying the exact same thing, that unless these conditions are met, lifting of 12 FAR cap will not be acceptable to this community board.
I think that, yeah, you're just reversing the order of the phrasing, but yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not use the word deny necessarily, because that's what you're implying. Just to sort of, because Christine is right, but you deny unless because there's a proposal being made and you want to either approve or deny it. But here we're actually proposing something in terms of set of conditions that must be met.
Can I just jump in there a quick second? I think the deny unless really does work when when there's a specific application.
Exactly.
And so I think that language, I think we can reword it to mean the same thing, but I just don't think it's going to be able to use that framing because it doesn't clearly make sense because there is no application. And I also think you don't want to get it mixed up with when review of it from the board and they have a different perspective. They may have a different perspective. I don't know, we don't know, but like, I just think we can say this, what we're trying to say, but without that specific phrasing, because it does get a little confusing.
So like to say this set of conditions must be met before any higher density residential is allowed.
I think we need to say, I would want to say that we are not in favor of lifting the cap. Yeah, this is the tricky part.
Yeah.
We are not in favor of lifting the cap, full stop.
But I'm not
If
sure.
that's out of our control, then
Yeah.
these things need to happen in order for us to support it. Yeah, it's an awkward.
Yeah, but that's not a board
Sentence.
position yet. The board position yet. We haven't come to that.
That's why I said it's my position. It would be,
Yeah.
my position.
Yeah, from the two different land use committee meetings and the HHS committee, saying that there's a consensus position to say, do not remove the cap. That bold of a statement does not have the support of the two land use committees and the HHSS committee. So it would be hard to make that definitive statement, but I think that to have language, because realistically, the cap is not being lifted.
No.
So to have language that says, these conditions must be met before the city can take any action. Now, the city can't take any action unless the state raises the cap, right? So we're saying these conditions must be met before any higher density will be allowed. And here are the conditions, right? Do not disrupt, we do not, we have a target of 30% affordability with a marginal increase of 40% above 12. We have a commitment to restricting it only to high density areas that are already currently zoned for high density, and areas that have commercial conversions occurring where the buildings are overbuilt above 12 already. And it would be a special permit process to get there.
I think if you could add, Paul, I know it's in your notes and Christine mentioned it too, but the, tying density to infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that in my notes, I think a couple of things that are in my notes are making sure that we kind of align with the Community Board 4's housing plan, like looking at this through that lens as well. And within any high density, the part of the special permit process is on community amenity space, schools, green space, public transportation, emergency facilities, all of those components. And I think, again,
And I think we should start talking about what we're going to do next.
Yep.
And
I think that
Paul just like in the affordable housing plan, so just flagging that all of these are assessed in the seeker process.
Awesome. That's exactly what I want to make sure is incorporated in this. So perfect. All right. Thanks, Lowell, for the time check. I appreciate it. So the question now is, where do we go next? So I feel like I can really just start drafting up some language for this and circulating amongst us, the working group members, to fine tune the language, make sure that clauses are put in, make sure that the language from housing plan is incorporated, make sure that priorities are set and whatnot. But I think I also give committee, whenever it's coming up next, I forget when it's next. I can say, these are sort of, we're in this framework of this set of conditions must be met before any higher density would be allowed. And here are sort of the 4 top line criteria. And put those forward and just verbally present that to executive committee. And that then we'll start working on specific language, because technically the letter would come from executive committee to go to full board. All right, Brad.
Hi, Paul. I just want to make sure that, my position's clear. I am not for a cap. I'm for this. And I also like everything everybody put in place, landmarks, existing areas that already have their zoning. But I'm not for saying we're not for unless. So I just want to be clear on that. So thanks, Paul. And I'm all for your 4 points, but I just want to make that clear.
But Brad, you would be in favor of us saying this set of conditions must be met before any higher density is allowed?
I'm more like Viren. Listen, this takes money. And if we're putting out there that there's all these obstacles in there to do it, it just won't get done. And then we won't get our affordable. So I like the component that was brought up saying if it's from state or city money at a certain threshold, then these things need to be addressed. I'm for that. But that's how I feel about it.
Okay. And then and going back to Roberta's earlier point, Varen, I see your hand. I'll call in a second. The notion that this letter is going to like the mayor and Garodnik and copying state, is that the strategy? Like the tone of our language is to the city. I see heads nodding.
Who was the second person, mayor and who?
The
Dan
mayor and Dan Garodnik, head of planning.
Yeah, I reserve my right to ask full board to ask for a letter to the state too, but yes, this letter is to the city.
Okay.
CC to Speaker Adams.
Oh, I think the CC list is extensive. I think it's the city council. I think this goes to this
we can figure
state.
this all out. We'll hit everything.
State, Tony gets it, Brad gets it, Liz gets it, everybody gets it.
We'll make sure everybody gets it.
And then maybe the New York Times gets it, and we say, like, we've once again developed a nuanced policy position that should be respected across the city. Who knows? Baron, you had a question?
Yeah, just a very quick question. overarching sort of theme of a task force. The first question is the city doesn't have a plan. Don't we want to ask for a plan or some response in that? You know?
Well, I think the plan is institute a special permit for higher density housing with these qualifications and restrictions on it. That's the plan. They don't have a plan. We're going to say, you need a plan. Here it is.
You could do that, but you know, the couple of points that Carrie was making and others were making is transportation infrastructure amenities, and that basically drives the whole point. So where you have lots of zones across the city which are heavily invested in terms of dense infrastructure, but not the same density of any kind of housing, let alone affordable housing. So that's what I mean. That, you know, when I talk about plan, I'm not talking about just this district, but citywide approach as to how do you go about it? Where do you plan this kind of shift?
Well, we can
Something
certainly
to that-
include, we can certainly in our letter have a few paragraphs on how to go about planning. But I think that our recommendations would be put a special permit in place that has this set of guidelines and targets.
No, I totally get it. My only ambition is that we definitely want to make sure that they do not keep targeting the higher density districts. They look across the board and find other spaces where this could actually live.
Well,
much more comfortably.
there is an interesting question though, because look at, we are a district that is high density, right? And so do we want to say to them, build in Long Island City, build in Bronxville, build every place else? Or do we want to say, we want to protect our area, which is we are the target group, right? Like we are the target district. If this goes through, we're going to get hit the hardest. So we should just use language to protect ourselves.
So I would actually push, we are quite dense, but because of the vast amount of commercial and manufacturing, we're actually not as dense as a lot of Manhattan, particularly the Upper East and Upper West sides. Long Island City, the really southern tip of Long Island City has R10. We don't have any R10. We have somewhat like effective R10 basically, but we don't have any, which is not to say that like we can quibble about this everywhere, but I think there will be many places.
I think we're getting into specific. I'm sorry, Roberta. I think we're getting into specific language, Paul, and I've got to jump to another call.
All right,
so
but essentially,
I think you should start drafting, and then we should all take a look at it.
And then insert language that you think, and then if we have a debate about specific language, we can have the group rehash it. All right, but we're at the point now where it's like, let's start writing up something and move it along.
And Paul, if you need any help, I'll be happy to work with you on this.
Thank you, Baron.
Same here. Let me know if I can be helpful.
Carrie?
Sure, whatever you need, Paul.
No, you turned up your mic. I thought you had something you wanted to say.
I was just going to say thank you. I found this really, really helpful today. Thank you.
All right. No, thanks.
Yeah,
All right,
I apologize, Paul, for being late, but
you missed all the fun, Mike.
I know, but the reason I joined in the first place was to get to the very point that you're at now. Yes, indeed. Time to move on. Let's see. Let's see some language and just be done. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Start writing, Paul. I'm dropping. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate
Paul,
it.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, everybody. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.